Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of betrayal, deception, and a deadly obsession. This is the story of a woman who, just 7 months pregnant, was killed in cold blood by two people who were supposed to protect her, her own mother-in-law and sister-in-law. A tale of jealousy, greed, and calculated violence. This case will leave you wondering, what lengths will someone go to when their perfect life is on the line? And how could someone so close, someone you trust, become capable of such unspeakable acts? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of the pregnant daughter-in-law's murder. Emily Carter had no idea that the people she trusted most, her own family, were quietly plotting her downfall. 7 months pregnant and filled with hope for her growing family, she would soon face a betrayal so horrifying that it would unfold right in front of her 2-year-old daughter, shattering her life in ways she could never imagine. In the peaceful suburban town of Westfield, Emily Carter was known to everyone as a picture of happiness. She was living what seemed like the perfect life. At 27, she had a beautiful daughter, a loving husband, and a home filled with warmth. James, her husband, was a civil engineer with a successful career, and although his job required him to travel frequently, their marriage had remained strong. The couple had been together for 5 years, and Emily felt they had built something solid. As a mother to a lively 2-year-old named Lily, Emily found her days filled with the chaos and joy of raising a child, while at the same time managing a home and maintaining a part-time job. Despite the distance, they had created a cozy home together where their young daughter, Lily, grew up surrounded by love. When Emily found out she was pregnant again, the joy was immense. She was 7 months along, and the couple was eagerly anticipating the arrival of their second child. They had been planning for a baby boy, and Emily spent her days organizing the nursery, picking out names, and thinking about how life would change when their family expanded. Despite her joy, she had started to notice a subtle but persistent discomfort whenever her in-laws came to visit. While Emily tried her best to maintain a good relationship with James' family, there was an undercurrent of tension she couldn't ignore. James' mother, Ruth, and his younger sister, Mia, were regular visitors at the family's home. Emily had always done her best to maintain good relationships with them, but there was an undeniable tension, especially between Emily and her mother-in-law. Ruth, a domineering woman in her mid-50s, had never been entirely supportive of their relationship. From the very beginning, Ruth had made it clear that she felt Emily wasn't quite good enough for her son. Ruth was a woman of strong opinions, used to getting what she wanted, and she believed that James deserved a partner from a wealthier, more prestigious background. Her criticisms were often veiled in concern, but they were unmistakably dismissive. Over the years, Emily had learned to tolerate Ruth's sharp comments and attempts to control every aspect of James' life. At first, Emily assumed Ruth's disapproval was just a phase, something she would eventually get over. But now, 7 years into their marriage, it had become clear that Ruth's disdain for Emily was not going away. Mia, James' younger sister, in her late 20s, was a more passive presence in the family dynamic. She was quiet, often deferring to her mother, and her relationship with Emily remained distant but cordial. Mia's silence was perhaps even more unsettling than Ruth's outbursts. Mia's eyes often lingered on Emily with a mixture of detachment and something more troubling, an absence of warmth or genuine affection. Emily had learned to brush off Mia's coldness, telling herself that perhaps Mia was simply shy or uncomfortable around her. Emily was no stranger to Ruth's possessive nature. Ruth had always been overly protective of James, and it was clear that she didn't want anyone, especially Emily, taking her place as the center of his world. What started as passive-aggressive comments during family dinners had escalated into constant pressure. Ruth began calling Emily more frequently, questioning her decisions and offering unsolicited advice. Mia, too, started becoming more present in their lives, always appearing whenever Ruth visited. Still, every time Ruth and Mia visited, there was an undeniable tension in the air. Emily had begun to feel as though she was living in a constant state of scrutiny. Ruth would make casual comments about how Emily handled motherhood, suggesting that Lily needed more discipline, or hinting that Emily wasn't doing enough to prepare for the new baby. There was always something that didn't sit right, an unsettling feeling that something was brewing just beneath the surface. One particular afternoon, after a particularly tense visit from Ruth, Emily found herself thinking about the dynamics of her relationship with her in-laws. It wasn't just that they were critical of her, it was that they seemed determined to undermine her at every turn. Emily had always been taught to respect her elders, to keep the peace for the sake of family. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Ruth was taking advantage of her good nature, and that Mia, though quieter, was complicit in it. Emily wondered what would happen when the new baby arrived. Would the tensions between her and her in-laws escalate further? And how would James, who was frequently away on business, handle it when he returned home? It wasn't just Ruth's criticism that had begun to wear on Emily. It was the nagging feeling that her in-laws saw her as a temporary fixture in their son's life, something to be tolerated until something better came along. Emily had always tried to be a good wife and mother, but with Ruth and Mia, it felt like she was constantly under a microscope. There were whispers around town, too, subtle comments from other women about how Emily was too young for James, how she didn't fit in with his family. Emily had long since learned to ignore such talk, but it was becoming harder to do so as time went on. The situation grew even more complicated when James had to travel abroad for a month-long project. Though she was used to him being away for work, this trip felt different. She could sense that there was something off in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. James had become more distant in the weeks leading up to his departure, perhaps due to stress from work. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. He seemed distracted, his attention divided between work and his concerns about her health during the pregnancy. His mother, Ruth, was already preparing for her role as the helpful grandmother, offering to step in and take care of Emily while James was away. When James left for the overseas project, Emily had mixed emotions. On one hand, she was used to managing things alone, but on the other hand, she couldn't ignore the sense of unease she felt in his absence. Ruth, ever the eager helper, began showing up at the house even more frequently. Mia, too, began to visit more often, offering unsolicited advice on everything from how to handle Lily to what brand of diapers to buy for the new baby. Emily smiled politely, trying to be grateful for their help, but the strain between them was undeniable. It was clear that Ruth and Mia had no intention of leaving her to handle things on her own. Instead, they seemed determined to insert themselves into every aspect of her life, even if it meant undermining her in the process. Emily had tried to make peace with Ruth, but it had only backfired. Ruth made it clear she didn't approve of Emily's decisions as a mother, and had warned her that she would never be able to handle both kids. Emily, exhausted from the emotional toll in her pregnancy, tried to brush off the remarks, but something deep inside her felt unsettled. She would never have imagined how true those words would become. One day, while Emily was out shopping for baby supplies, Ruth and Mia showed up unannounced. Emily returned home to find them sitting in her living room, having a heated discussion. When Emily asked what was going on, Ruth immediately shifted the conversation, accusing Emily of neglecting Lily's behavior. Mia silently nodded in agreement. Emily, stunned by the sudden confrontation, tried to defend herself, but the words became increasingly harsh. Ruth's eyes gleamed with anger as she accused Emily of being an incompetent mother who couldn't handle the responsibility of a second child. Emily felt the walls closing in on her. She had always respected Ruth as her elder, but now she felt trapped in her own home. Ruth and Mia's passive-aggressive behavior was starting to feel like something far more sinister. After that day, things seemed to settle down briefly, but Emily couldn't escape the sense of dread that hung over her. Every time Ruth and Mia visited, it felt like a storm was brewing, and Emily had no idea just how close that storm was. 2 weeks passed without incident, but the atmosphere at home grew increasingly tense. Emily began to avoid her in-laws, no longer eager to entertain their visits. Ruth and Mia, however, refused to let up. They showed up at her doorstep uninvited, bringing gifts for Lily and insisting on helping with the nursery. But behind their smiles, Emily sensed something darker at play. Ruth's disapproval of Emily's marriage had always been a cloud hanging over them, but now it seemed to have transformed into something far more dangerous. Despite the tension, Emily continued to push forward, focusing on her pregnancy and preparing for the arrival of their son. But the more time she spent with Ruth and Mia, the more she began to question the true nature of their visits. Were they truly there to help, or was something more sinister at play? Emily began to feel like she was living in a house filled with lies. her every move being watched and judged by those who were supposed to be her family. The fear that had been building in the back of her mind began to take root. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. As the days passed, Emily found herself in a constant state of alert. She knew Ruth and Mia would be back soon, and with them, the creeping anxiety that something was going to happen. She had no idea just how close she was to the nightmare that would shatter her world and her family forever. The days after James's departure were long and filled with unease. Emily had always managed on her own, but this time felt different. Ruth's presence in the house was suffocating, her constant visits starting to feel less like family support and more like surveillance. At first, Emily had been grateful for the help. Ruth seemed well-meaning, offering to babysit Lily so Emily could rest, bringing over meals, and trying to ease her concerns about the upcoming birth. But soon the visits became too frequent, too insistent. Ruth's remarks began to feel less like guidance and more like criticism. As Emily neared the end of her pregnancy, she began to notice subtle changes in Ruth's behavior. The mother-in-law, who had always been demanding but at least somewhat cordial, now seemed openly disdainful. Ruth would often comment on how Emily was letting herself go during the pregnancy, or how she wasn't doing enough to prepare for the new baby. Each remark was wrapped in the guise of concern, but Emily couldn't help but feel that it was something more malicious, something darker. Ruth's expectations were impossible to meet, and Emily felt the strain of constantly trying to live up to them, even though it was becoming clear that nothing she did would ever be enough for her mother-in-law. Mia, Ruth's quiet daughter, had always been a passive presence, but even she began to act differently. Where once she had been the silent observer, Mia now seemed to take her mother's side in every conversation. Emily, who had once tried to form a friendship with her sister-in-law, now found herself growing more distant from her. There were moments when Mia would stare at Emily with a look of disdain, her eyes betraying an icy indifference. Emily couldn't quite understand it. Mia had always been a quiet figure, but now there was something unsettling about the way she interacted with her. She would come over more frequently, offering help around the house, but there was something about her presence that made Emily uncomfortable. It was as though Mia was no longer the shy, awkward woman she had once known, but was now an accomplice in something much darker. As the days stretched on, Emily's unease began to grow. The tension in the house was palpable. Ruth and Mia were always there, always watching, as if waiting for something. Emily didn't know what it was, but the anxiety gnawed at her every time they entered the room. It felt as though they were waiting for her to slip up, to falter in some way, but for what? She couldn't explain it, but the more time she spent in their company, the more she felt like a prisoner in her own home. Despite her growing discomfort, Emily tried to focus on the positives. Her health was good. The baby was healthy. And Lily was as energetic and happy as ever. But the shadow of Ruth and Mia's presence cast a pall over everything. Even when James called, as he did frequently from overseas, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. James, despite his best intentions, couldn't seem to see what she was going through. He tried to be supportive, but the distance between them, both physical and emotional, was starting to take its toll on their relationship. There were nights when Emily would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut that something was horribly wrong. She kept thinking back to all the strange moments, Ruth's biting comments, Mia's cold stares, and it all started to make sense in a way that terrified her. She was alone, isolated, and no one seemed to understand her fear. Even her daughter, Lily, seemed to sense the change. The little girl would often cling to Emily, her small fingers wrapped tightly around her mother's hand, as if seeking comfort from an unknown threat. One afternoon, when Ruth and Mia arrived unannounced, Emily felt her stomach twist with a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just their constant presence, it was something about the way they moved through the house, the way they looked at her, as though they were plotting something just out of reach. Emily had no concrete reason to suspect them, nothing other than her own growing unease, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the dynamics in the house had changed. Ruth and Mia had started to act like they were in charge, like Emily was the intruder in her own home. It was as if they were setting the stage for something, and Emily had no idea what it was. Every interaction felt like a performance, each one filled with hidden motives she couldn't quite decipher. It was clear that they were both playing some sort of game, but Emily couldn't figure out the rules. Why had they become so obsessed with her? Why were they pushing so hard to insert themselves into every part of her life? And what was it they wanted from her? As the days passed, the tension between them reached a breaking point. Emily tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Lily's sake, but it was becoming impossible to ignore the feeling that something was about to happen. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Ruth and Mia weren't just visiting, they were taking over. Emily had no idea what they had planned, but she knew deep down that she couldn't trust them. The realization hit her hard, leaving her with a profound sense of isolation. She couldn't turn to James, not with him halfway across the world, and her attempts to reach out to friends had been met with nothing more than empty assurances. One evening, as Emily sat alone in the living room, the weight of the situation finally sank in. Ruth and Mia had left for the night, but their influence lingered. Emily felt trapped in her own home, caught between a family that seemed determined to tear her down and a life that was slipping out of her control. Her body ached with exhaustion, both from the pregnancy and the constant stress. She tried to keep her mind occupied, focusing on the baby, on Lily, but the knot in her stomach tightened with every passing day. What had started as a quiet, nagging suspicion had now grown into an undeniable certainty something was coming, and she wasn't prepared for it. And then it happened. Late one evening after Ruth and Mia had left the house, Emily found herself staring at the front door, as if expecting them to return. The house was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the city outside. The sense of impending danger was palpable. She could feel it in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that was impossible to ignore. Whatever Ruth and Mia were planning, the end was near, and Emily didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending everything was okay. She could feel the storm approaching, and it was only a matter of time before it would break. Emily woke up that morning feeling a strange heaviness in the air. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as Lily played contentedly in the corner of the living room. Despite the stillness, there was an unease she couldn't shake. Her instincts, sharpened by months of subtle tension, were screaming at her. Ruth and Mia had been more present than ever, and their sudden absence that day felt like a calculated move rather than a coincidence. Emily brushed the thought aside, trying to focus on her routine, but the feeling clung to her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. As the hours crept by, the silence began to feel oppressive. Emily found herself glancing over her shoulder, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. Every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind outside made her jump. It was as though the house itself had turned against her, its once familiar walls now harboring an unseen menace. She tried to keep busy, folding laundry and organizing Lily's toys, but the unease refused to leave her. By the afternoon, Ruth and Mia arrived, their sudden appearance jarring against the quiet of the morning. They entered the house with a familiarity that unsettled Emily, as though it were theirs, not hers. Ruth carried a casserole dish, her face set in an expression of forced cheerfulness. Mia trailed behind her mother, her hands empty but her demeanor heavy with something unspoken. Emily felt her stomach tighten as they moved through the house, their presence shifting the atmosphere. It was the same suffocating dynamic she had grown used to, but today it felt different. There was a tension in the air that made her skin crawl. Ruth busied herself in the kitchen, insisting on preparing lunch for everyone, while Mia lingered in the living room. Emily sat stiffly on the couch, her hands resting protectively on her pregnant belly. Lily played on the floor nearby, her laughter a fragile thread of normalcy in the otherwise stifling environment. Mia's gaze was fixed on Emily, her expression unreadable. It wasn't curiosity or concern, it was something colder, more detached. Emily avoided looking directly at her, focusing instead on Lily, but she could feel Mia's eyes on her, unrelenting and unsettling. Lunch was an exercise in discomfort. Ruth dominated the conversation, her tone overly bright as she talked about mundane topics. Emily barely ate, her appetite dulled by the weight in her chest. She noticed how Ruth's eyes lingered on her every movement, her every word dissected and scrutinized. Mia remained mostly silent, her presence a shadow that loomed over the table. Emily felt like a stranger in her own home, an outsider in a space that should have been her sanctuary. After the meal, Ruth suggested that Mia take Lily outside to play, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Emily hesitated but didn't argue, knowing that any resistance would only escalate the tension. Mia led Lily to the backyard, her movements brisk and purposeful. Emily watched them through the window, her unease growing as the distance between her and her daughter felt like more than just physical space. Inside, Ruth's demeanor shifted. She no longer bothered with the pretense of pleasantries, her gaze sharp and piercing. Emily could feel the shift in the dynamic, the subtle power play that Ruth had been orchestrating for months now laid bare. Ruth's words were cutting, her tone laced with judgment and disdain. Emily remained silent, unwilling to engage in the game Ruth was so clearly playing. But her silence only seemed to fuel Ruth's dominance, her voice growing louder, more insistent. Emily excused herself, retreating to the safety of her bedroom. The door closed behind her, the faint sound of Ruth's voice muffled but still audible. She leaned against the wall, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts, Her heart raced as she tried to calm herself to regain some sense of control. But the unease had burrowed deep, its grip unrelenting. She glanced at the clock, counting the hours until James's next call. She needed to hear his voice, to feel some connection to the life they had built together, a life that felt so distant now. The afternoon dragged on, the tension in the house thickening with each passing minute. Emily's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Ruth and Mia's behavior had been growing more erratic, more invasive. It was no longer just about control, it felt like something else entirely, something far more dangerous. She couldn't ignore the warning signs any longer. The instinctual fear that told her she was in danger. By evening, the unease had transformed into outright fear. Emily tried to call James, but the line went to voicemail. She left a message, her voice trembling as she tried to keep her words calm and measured. She didn't want to alarm him, but she needed him to know that something was wrong. As she hung up, she felt a pang of loneliness, the distance between them a chasm she couldn't bridge. That night, as Emily put Lily to bed, she felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the comforting stillness she had once known. It was a silence filled with tension, a silence that screamed of something waiting in the shadows. She double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, her movements quick and deliberate. Her hands trembled as she turned off the lights, the darkness amplifying her fear. She lay in bed, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't silence. Every sound, every creak and groan of the house made her jump. Sleep eluded her as she stared at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on her. The unease that had followed her all day had grown into a full-blown sense of impending doom. She couldn't explain it, couldn't articulate why she felt this way, but she knew something was coming. And whatever it was, it would change everything. It wasn't until the night of the tragic event that Emily finally realized the depth of the danger she was in. As Emily lay in bed, exhausted from another long day of caring for Lily and preparing for the baby, she received a phone call from James. He was in a hotel room in a distant country, working late on a project. Emily assured him everything was fine and that she was just tired. They exchanged loving words, and for a brief moment, Emily felt a sense of normalcy return. But that night, everything changed. Ruth and Mia arrived at her doorstep just after midnight. Emily, drowsy but polite, let them in. They claimed they wanted to check on her and offer some last-minute advice before James returned. But their visit was anything but friendly. Emily would later learn that Ruth and Mia had been planning her death for weeks. They had carefully orchestrated their scheme to eliminate Emily and take control of James' life, believing that they could step in as his new family. Ruth, consumed by jealousy and hatred for Emily, had convinced Mia that it was the only way to restore order. Together, they plotted Emily's murder, knowing that the best time to strike would be when James was overseas, far from home. The night of Emily's murder unfolded with a sinister, calculated precision. Ruth and Mia had waited until the house was quiet, and they knew that Emily's guard would be down. They had played their roles well, acting like concerned family members, offering false comfort and support. But deep inside, they were prepared to execute the final step of their plan. As Emily prepared to go to sleep, she heard a knock at the door. It was Ruth and Mia. They were standing in the entryway, pretending to be there out of kindness, as if to offer advice or some last-minute assistance before James returned. But there was no kindness in their eyes. "Emily, we just wanted to talk to you for a minute," Ruth said, her voice smooth, though tinged with something darker. Mia stood silently by her side, her expression unreadable. Tired and caught off guard, Emily hesitated for only a moment. She knew her mother-in-law could be overbearing, but she never thought it would come to this. "All right, come in," she said, stepping aside to let them into the living room. The moment the door closed behind them, the atmosphere shifted. The house, once warm and filled with laughter, now felt cold and oppressive. Emily could sense it. The air felt thick, heavy with something wrong. Ruth immediately launched into a tirade, accusing Emily of neglecting her responsibilities. Her words, dripping with venom, were a stark contrast to her outward appearance of concern. "You've never been good enough for James," Ruth spat, her eyes narrowing as she paced around the room. "You're just a burden to him. You can't even take care of one child, let alone two. You've failed him." Emily, shocked and disoriented by the aggression in Ruth's tone, tried to defend herself, but Ruth wasn't interested in listening. Mia, ever silent, stood in the background, her face emotionless. The tension was suffocating. The argument escalated quickly, with Ruth growing louder and more aggressive. Emily felt her heart racing, but it wasn't just fear she felt betrayed. She had spent years trying to keep peace with this woman, and now Ruth was exposing the full depth of her hatred. Ruth had never liked her, but this was more than just dislike. This was a deep-rooted, dangerous resentment. Then, without warning, Ruth lunged at Emily. Emily was caught off guard, unable to react in time. Ruth pushed her to the ground, and the impact knocked the breath out of her. As Emily tried to scramble to her feet, she realized that Mia wasn't just standing by idly, she was helping her mother. Mia grabbed Emily's arms, holding her down while Ruth climbed on top of her. Emily's screams for help were silenced by Ruth's grip on her throat. Ruth's eyes were wild with anger, and for a brief moment, Emily could see something cold and calculated in them. This wasn't just an argument that had gotten out of hand, it was a deliberate act of violence. Mia, holding Emily's arms, never flinched. She looked down at her sister-in-law with no emotion, as if she were watching a mundane scene unfold. Emily struggled with all her strength, but the two women were stronger than she could have ever anticipated. In her desperation, she kicked and punched, but it was futile. Her vision began to blur as the lack of air suffocated her. Ruth didn't stop until Emily's movements ceased, and her body grew limp. The silence that followed was deafening. Mia released Emily's arms, and Ruth slowly stood up, wiping her hands on her clothes as if she had just finished a chore. The two women looked at each other, their faces expressionless, as if they had just completed something long planned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was Mia who broke the silence, her voice cold and emotionless. "It's done." The next morning, Lily woke up to find her mother lying motionless on the floor of the living room. The little girl, barely old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, toddled over to her mother's side, calling out for her. But Emily didn't respond. Ruth and Mia, who had made sure to leave the house quietly during the night, didn't return until the afternoon. When they arrived, they found a devastated Lily still sitting next to her mother's lifeless body, holding on to her as if she were merely asleep. The sight of the child's confusion and innocence seemed to snap something in Mia, but she quickly hardened again, dismissing any remorse. Meanwhile, Ruth made the final call. She contacted James in the morning, pretending to be concerned. She told him that Emily had suddenly collapsed in her sleep and that an ambulance had been called. Ruth knew that James was thousands of miles away, and there was nothing he could do. She also knew that the police would not immediately suspect anything foul, not with Emily's pregnancy and her supposed health issues. James, frantic and unable to be there for his wife, received a phone call from the hospital that confirmed his worst nightmare. Emily had died. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, though the medical staff would later revise their statement after a closer investigation revealed that Emily had been strangled. James, utterly devastated, returned home as soon as possible, but the wheels of tragedy had already been set in motion. When Ruth and Mia were questioned by the authorities, they stuck to their story: Emily had died in her sleep. No foul play involved. They were calm, collected, and completely convincing. But the cracks in their story began to show after the police conducted a thorough investigation. Emily's autopsy revealed the truth: strangulation marks around her neck, and soon, the police turned their attention toward Ruth and Mia. The investigation was painstakingly slow, but as they delved deeper into the details, they uncovered the disturbing history between Emily and her in-laws. Ruth's resentment of Emily's relationship with James and her unrelenting desire to control his life painted a picture of motive. Mia's complete lack of emotional reaction, her cold detachment in the face of such violence, only added to the suspicion. When the police finally arrested Ruth and Mia, they found them utterly unfazed by the gravity of the situation. Ruth, in her arrogance, believed she had outsmarted everyone, while Mia simply followed her mother's lead, as she always had. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with shocking details of the crime revealed in every hearing. Ruth and Mia were both convicted of murder. Ruth was sentenced to life in prison, while Mia, due to her younger age, received a reduced sentence. The case left the community in shock, and James, who had returned to bury his wife, was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered family. Emily's story was one of betrayal, deception, and a tragic loss of life. It was a stark reminder that sometimes those trust the most are capable of the greatest harm. Thank you for watching Mystery Minds. If you found this case as haunting as we did, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share this story with others and turn on notifications so you never miss another unsettling case. The truth is often darker than fiction, and we'll keep uncovering it, one chilling tale at a time. Until next time, stay vigilant because the darkness is always closer than it seems.